Okay, Chris, first and foremost, thanks very much for joining me. I do just want to start before we sort of get into it by asking you about your experience this season. You know, being the voice of Norwich City, commentating on the games for Radio Norfolk. Obviously, I'm sure that's not new information to the people watching. But your experience this season, now, maybe I'm putting words in your mouth here, but would you say it's been hollow at all without the fans?
Yeah, I would say I've loved it this season because Norwich have done so well and Norwich have won the league and they've played some tremendous football. But there has always been that nagging sense of this isn't quite normal, and I've found that really difficult to get my head around. It was after the game where Norwich won the league against Reading, and I know that's a bit of a spoiler alert for anybody who's watching this review, as to see what happens with the season. A spoiler straight from the start. But it was only after that game where I saw the fans, outside, and the players who and Daniel Farker went to greet them. That was for me. That was the first time I really got the idea that, do you know what? Actually, this has hit home, and this season has meant a lot to the people watching and listening from home. I wasn't so sure that it ever would. I didn't like the behind closed doors football. I think our first experience of it with Project Restart was an absolute nightmare in the Premier League. Not just that Norwich were losing every week. It was just so strange. Not having proper choruses of On the Ball City, not having that real sense of community you get around a match day. It felt empty in all senses being at Carrow Road. And my instinct was that people would very quickly get fed up with it and might even lose interest. They didn't, and I'm a little bit surprised by that, but I suppose I shouldn't have been because we know how much Norfolk people and Norwich City fans in particular love their football. So, in terms of the actual match day experience, going to the games, it hasn't been the same. It's been nowhere near as good. But I think we've got to be careful that we don't take anything away from Daniel Farke and from the players who've done their bit. They've done all that could be asked for them. That what they've done has been superb. I just think that in years to come, this will be remembered as the team that nobody really saw. I'm thinking about players like Oliver Skipp. If he doesn't come back, a handful of people ever saw him play for Norwich City, which is such a shame. And I think what will always be lacking from this season is those great stories you get from the away trips to places like Rotherham, where Norwich got a really important last minute penalty from Jordan Hugill. That would have been a wonderful away day. There would have been many others as well. Players like Ollie Skipp, Ben Gibson, new arrivals this season, never got their own song. Hopefully we'll get the opportunity to do that later. And I think those things will always be missing. So it's been a great season to watch. I'm really lucky to have been to most of the games, to have seen Norwich play some wonderful football, play the rest of the Championship off the park. But the real colour when it comes to football memories and football coverage comes from the supporters. And we're just not going to have that about this season, which is a shame. But as I mentioned, Daniel Farke and the players, it's not down to them. They've done their bit and they've done it superbly.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm a season ticket holder myself, and I do try to sort of be a glass half full type of guy. So I think when I remember this season, it'll be during this very dark year where we've all had really sort of tough times personally. Norwich City was sort of that light at the end of the tunnel. It was that sort of sense of normality, wasn't it? And that's the phrase that gets tossed about usually when we talk about this season. Norwich City, it was something to look forward to, wasn't it, during a global pandemic? And for that, I think I will definitely look back on this memory with this season with fond memories, which, it's a title winning season, so you can't not. But it is a tragedy that we couldn't be then. You're right to point out about the players like Ollie Skipp, Ben Gibson not having their own songs. I, for one, am absolutely gutted. I will never have seen Ollie Skipp play for Norwich in the flesh. I wasn't lucky enough to be one of the fans to go down during the few games where there was fans, and it'll go down as a tragedy to me. But at the same time, Norwich have won the title, and that's not too bad, is it? Now, I think we should start with sort of the transfer window. It was a very busy one, as we expected. Norwich were in the mud, really, weren't they? I think sort of on the pitch, maybe from beyond Norfolk, it looked like Norwich were really in trouble, but from within, there was still sort of the trust the process saying being thrown around for the right reason. Now, upon reflection, that transfer window, how do you rate that in terms of business overall? Would you say it was a very successful one?
At the start of the season, I think, with hindsight, I think it definitely was. I think I at the start of the season, had my concerns. I think not that I didn't fully trust the process, and it's not that I didn't believe in Stuart Webber and Daniel Farke, because we'd seen what they could do in the Championship before, but we had also seen how difficult teams find it when they drop out of the Premier League, and particularly when they drop out of the Premier League in such bruising fashion. That I mentioned it earlier, that Project Restart, those last 9 or 10 games of last season. My goodness, that's the toughest watch I've had as a Norwich City commentator or supporter, because we weren't scoring goals, we didn't look like scoring goals, and I think there was a real sort of concern that that squad had run its course. And how do you come back from that? Let's not forget, it was a record-breaking run of defeats, wasn't it? And when Project Restart did begin, I know we all thought the Norwich were up against it, but they had Burnley at home, Southampton at home, West Ham at home, trying to remember what the fixtures were now, Everton at home. It felt like they had the games were there where they had a chance to at least make a fight of staying up, Watford away, and they ended up losing them all. And I think the way they went down, as much as we knew relegation was a possibility and a risk of last season, I think the way the season ended and the way relegation came about, you remember that ignominious defeat at Carrow Road where Dermich and Buendia both got sent off against Burnley. And I think as much as you hoped and you had faith in the players that were there and you knew they could do it, I think there's always that concern as to how much of a hangover there would be when you've been relegated like that. And maybe we saw a bit of that at the start of the season, but the way they came back was admirable, and I was really impressed. But in terms of the summer, I liked a lot of the signings they made from the off. The one I was, there were two I was really pleased about. One was Ben Gibson, because I think we all felt, the heart of that Norwich defence did need a little bit of work. We knew Ben Godfrey would probably go. I mean, it's amazing to think he did actually play in the first 3 or 4 games of the season for Norwich. It seems so long since he was a Norwich player, but we knew he was likely to go. They needed another Grant Hanley type alongside Grant Hanley, who I think clearly had been Norwich's best centre-back last season, Grant Hanley. So to get Ben Gibson, that was a partnership I always had faith in. I was really pleased that they got Gibson. It was just about whether the two of them could stay fit, and by and large they did. They did for enough of the season to get the job done, certainly. The other one I was excited about was Kieran Dowell, who I'd seen play in the Championship before and knew he could do it. I think when Norwich signed him, I expected that probably meant that either Buendia or Campbell would go. So that was slightly tempered the excitement of getting him. Actually, we've had to wait until much later on in the season, and another spoiler alert there, to see the real quality of Dowell and what he can bring to a Championship team. So those are the two I was most excited about. And Jordan Hugill, I thought, proven Championship. The rest of them, looking at who came in last summer, you just didn't know, did you? Because even Oliver Skipp, great pedigree, but we've had young players come in from Premier League clubs before and not do it at Norwich City. So it was very difficult. I mean, with hindsight, fantastic bit of business, but at the time, it was difficult to be that confident about it.
You make me smile there, Chris, because you mentioned two names as the most exciting, Ben Gibson and Kieran Dowell. And I remember saying on a podcast a few times, really, that they were two players I wasn't that excited for. So for Ben Gibson, it was a case of I wasn't really... Now, this was as a result of the frustration of post-lockdown Norwich, the shambles you mentioned. You actually took me back to before in February 2020, when I was saying that run of fixtures is what was going to keep Norwich up. I think that's what a lot of people thought, didn't they? I maintained that after sort of lockdown. Obviously, everyone was completely wrong about that, totally wrong. But it was that period of adaptation mixed with the frustration of the previous season where I didn't know if I could be bothered to watch Ben Gibson grow. I was that frustrated, but I'm so happy now to put my hands up and say I was completely wrong. Ben Gibson, absolutely fantastic. Love the guy. I think the most important thing about him is that he's a leader, and as you said, sort of that relationship with Grant Hanley, where they're both sort of veterans of English football now. They know what they're doing. It's what Norwich needed. Ben Godfrey, I saw a post earlier, I can't remember what media outlet it was, but it was about who's been the most impressive signing in the Premier League, and Ben Godfrey was on that list. So there's no doubt about his quality, but the quality that Ben Gibson, that experience, that sort of level-headedness that he brought in was a necessity. And as you mentioned, that little spoiler there, Kieran Dowell, we've had to wait a fair while throughout a season that no doubt for him has been incredibly frustrating with his injuries, but thankfully he's sort of making that number 10 position his own. There was the question about Mario Vrancic wasn't there and whether that should be his role. Obviously next season that's not the case, for reasons we'll speak about maybe a little bit later in this video. But yeah, in terms of sort of signings beyond those two, was there any maybe that you doubted at all? Or is it just a case of the names that you weren't familiar with, like Shemusaf Poeta, Javi Quintilla? Was there perhaps a little bit of doubt at any point?
Yeah, I think though the two you mentioned there, it's difficult. It was difficult to have a definite opinion on because I didn't know them. I'd not seen them play. As with every new signing, you can find dozens of videos on YouTube and online that make these players look really really good. But I think because I'd seen Norwich City in the Championship before and I'd seen them go course and distance and had an idea of not so much what was needed, but what it takes to succeed in the Championship and what it would take to get over last year. I remember quite early on in my commentary career, I was commentating on a team that had just been relegated from the Premier League in ignominious fashion, losing 6-0 to Fulham, and Norwich came down with a team that had Robert Green, Dean Ashton, Darren Huckabee, and co in it, and we thought, well, we'll come straight back, and we didn't. And I think having been through that, you looked at the squad on paper and thought, well, I think they're good enough. I know they're good enough to do it in the Championship, but the Championship is full of clubs who've gone down thinking they're good enough to go back up and have never managed it. So that was my concern, really, how much the relegation would affect them. And I felt that it was a time for real unspectacular sort of steadying influences, if you like. And Gibson was definitely that. Jordan Hugill, I thought as well, was exactly the sort of player that dressing room and that squad needed to get them over relegation. The others, you just sort of, you have to wait and see, don't you? I think if Norwich City over the last 4 years under Daniel Farke have taught us anything, it's that you cannot rush to judge a signing and judge a player. Many of us had written off Mario Vrancic and Marco Stiepermann after, even at the end of their first season. I know on the radio we had calls from people saying, well, these two lads haven't got it, they haven't got what it takes. And yet a year later, they had really inspired promotion. So I think it was a strange summer. It was a really quick turnaround. It wasn't a proper pre-season, was it? Because one season finished in July, the next one started in early September. And if you remember, the very first game of the season was a cup tie at Luton when most of the players were away on international duty. So it was a really difficult summer in which to get business done. And I think it was always going to take a little while for players to settle. And so patience was definitely a virtue at the start of the season. Expecting immediate impact from these signings maybe was never going to happen.
Yeah, the title of this video is Expectation versus Reality, and they were two very differing things. I think so that was the case for sort of within Norfolk. Beyond Norfolk, really, it was Norwich were expected to bounce back up because of sort of the parachute payment talk, etc. And this idea that they've got players like Pukki, Buendia, Krul that should take them straight back up. Within Norfolk, that wasn't the case. Thankfully, we have gone back up, by the way. I should just mention that. Now, before we talk about football specifically and football matches, I want to talk a little bit about the outgoings because there are some interesting names on this list. You've got Ben Godfrey and Jamal Lewis. Now, I don't think there's too much to say about those two players, really. Two very good servants to Norwich City. I think Ben Godfrey has had a bit more success than Jamal Lewis, but I think the intention behind Norwich's model, those players, is develop these players, sell them for big money, let them have sort of fruitful careers, etc. Names that surprise me on this list in terms of outgoings, you've got Sam McCallum and Daniel Sinani. Now, we haven't really seen any of them play for Norwich, have we? I think maybe Sinani played in a couple of friendlies. He might have played against Luton. I know Sam McCallum did start against Luton. But were those two sort of outgoings surprising to you at all? Because there was a bit of fuss made about Sinani, wasn't there?
Yeah, I think last year, at this time, we were looking for things to get excited about, weren't we? And again, people had done their internet research, their YouTube research, and had found Sinani in particular scoring some spectacular goals. And we thought we had a player here. We always think we're going to get another Pukki now, don't we? A player who maybe we don't know too much about, or a Buendia, but who's going to come in and really take the division by storm. And now every time that doesn't happen, we get a little bit disappointed. I think the departures of Godfrey and Lewis really, that's where we are now as Norwich City. And I think that there are two fascinating sort of case studies that we've got to remember, really, because they were two of our best players. They were two players that we didn't want to lose. Norwich fans really rated Ben Godfrey and Jamal Lewis. They did both go. They went for big money. They both went to Premier League clubs. And yet, with the best will in the world, Norwich haven't really missed them. Now, I know that sounds tremendously disrespectful, but because of course you'd love Ben Godfrey, you'd love Jamal Lewis in your squad this season if you were Daniel Farke. But the way Norwich City are now, and this is something I think we've got to try and remember, is that they have accepted the fact that players are going to leave. If you get to a point where you're Norwich City, and I've grown up with it for years and years, that there's always going to be clubs further up the footballing food chain who will be able to sign your players, whether you like it or not. If they're going to have the cash, they're going to have the pull, they're going to be able to pay the wages to prize these players away. So rather than trying to resist it and hold on to players for dear life and milk every last possible bit of talent out of them, the way Norwich are doing it now in terms of just getting them on as longer contracts as possible, really developing them, And when they go, making sure they get not just the best possible transfer fee they can for them, but also knowing that they've got a replacement. The next cab off the rank is there. That's the way Norwich have got to go. And that they've done it so well with the players we're talking about now. You've seen Ben Godfrey go, and there's Ben Gibson, and suddenly people don't really talk about Ben Godfrey anymore, as good a player as he is. Jamal Lewis has gone, and actually in the end several players have had a go at left back for Norwich this season, and in their own way that they've filled that Jamal Lewis shaped void really, really well. So this is the way it's going to be when it comes to the point that players like Buendia, Cantwell, Max Aarons go. That's the challenge that Norwich have set themselves. As and when they go, you've got to have the next cab off the rank ready to come in. I mean, James Maddison's another great example. Remember when he went at the end of Daniel Farke's first season, and we all thought, well, that's it now. We finished 14th and we've lost our best player. And yet we got promoted the next season because Buendia came in, and that sort of evolution that Norwich have got now, this family tree where, that position goes, that player goes, here's the next one, the next generation comes in. It's tough. It's really difficult to get it right and to always have as good a replacement to come in, but that's what Norwich have got to do. And I think the way they've handled the departures of Godfrey and Lewis, that's got to be the model.
Yeah, that's been the case, isn't it? As you mentioned, throughout sort of Daniel Farke's tenure, really, and it's a credit. It should be a tribute, really, to Stuart Webber and his ability to replace these players. I think another example from the first towards the second season under this Webolution would be when Angus Gunn left. I remember being really sort of apprehensive about how are we going to replace this really promising young goalkeeper. Tim Krul comes in, and now I think Tim Krul is the best goalie I've seen play for Norwich in my lifetime that I can remember. I'll mention that because I think I was born in time for Rob Green, but I don't think I can sort of remember that as a 4 or 5.
Too young to remember Rob Green. Goodness me.
yeah. Do you know what? There's a good comparison here because you've got this shirt, haven't you? We spoke about this before. Where this is a club shop one, a retro one, whereas you've got the original, which is.
I've got it here. Look, that's the original. And it looks like it still fits me on Zoom, but if you can, I don't know if I can do it on the label. It's large boys size because I wore this at the time and I'd forgotten, but it is, I don't know who signed, I have to look at it properly later, but it is actually signed by some of my heroes growing up. I must have worn it at an open day or something like this. So I'll have to try and work out who signed that. But yeah, I've been going through some of my old sort of Norwich City shirts just recently, and there's a couple more of them behind that are originals. They won't fit me now. That's why I've got to hang them on the wall because I can't squeeze into them because they're children's sizes. But yeah, I've seen many more yellow and green kits than I care to mention. Never mind goalkeepers.
Yeah, as a football shirt collector myself, I can relate to that. Sort of like to my left here is my cupboard, and I just see a sea of yellow and green. It's ridiculous. Those shirts behind you, by the way, are 3 of the very best. I think that special edition shirt will be remembered in the same sort of fashion as the 2 behind it. That Asics top is delightful, and if the club was to ever release a retro sort of version of it like they did for this one, I would be absolutely all over that. But to go back to the football now, it's beautiful, and Norwich have got a history of beautiful kits, haven't they? That's why we love this football club. But to go back to the football, Tim Closer is an interesting name. What did you make of him leaving? Because post lockdown, I gave him a hard time. It was kind of harsh, and let me just please say it was mainly because of the stress of the season. I do understand that he'd been out for a year, but I remember after Chelsea just sort of thinking, I think he's done at Norwich. Was it a surprise to you at all when he sort of departed for Basel?
Not really, because I think you're right. I think there was a sense that probably his time with Norwich was coming to an end. But I think I know what you mean about the end of last season, but I felt quite sorry for him because he'd had all that time out. And I don't think the idea was for him to have to play those last 10 games of the season. But my old mate Grant Hanley, who I keep talking up because I did think he was fantastic last season as well. That win over Leicester, the last game, many people were at Carrow Road. He played in that game. The one where they just lost 1-0 to Liverpool. He played in that game. He played at Spurs in the epic cup tie. That little run where Norwich started to look as if they might get out of trouble. That's when Grant Hanley was in the team. Remember his goal at Burnley in the previous round of the cup as well. And I really thought when he was playing, even in the Premier League, Norwich didn't win every game. They're never going to in the Premier League, but they looked much steadier with him in the team. So losing him ahead of that restart was a huge blow. And I think poor old Tim Closer had to go in, probably wasn't ready really to play that number of games in such a short space of time. So sad to see somebody who always gave his best for Norwich City leave in such a way, really, because he was bought to play in the Premier League and Norwich got relegated in his first season with him injured. And when they got back up finally, he spent most of the season injured again. So he never really got the crack at the big time that he deserved. But with him going, I think it comes down to replacements, doesn't it? The only thing I was concerned that he'd left because it again left Norwich with, I thought, three centre backs, and we'd had all this trouble in the Premier League with Alex Tettey and Ibrahim Amadou having to stand in as temporary central defenders. So in some ways, closer leaving made sense, but my concern was that you had Gibson and Hanley, both of whom we had reason to wonder whether they could get a full season in, and we had Christoph Zimmermann, who'd had his own injury problems, and they were the only three fit centre halves. Now I remember talking to people at the club at the time and saying, "Oh, three centre halves, are you sure?" And a lot of people at the club said, well, Daniel likes this Andrew Omobamidele, who at that point we hadn't seen really in the first team. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And actually, we've seen why, haven't we, again, over the closing weeks of the season. He was the fourth choice centre-back for good reason. And had Hanley or Gibson broken down earlier on in the season, I think he may well have got even more of a chance and wouldn't have let us down. So again, Daniel Farker, if there's one thing over the last 4 years he's earned, it is we trust him when it comes to judging young players and when to play them. That's one thing he definitely can do. So if Daniel Farker thought Andrew Omobamidele was good enough to be part of the first team squad, then yeah, good enough for me, and he was absolutely right.
Yeah, Stuart Webber made a point of it on this channel. We're talking January 2019, which seems like a lifetime ago now, of saying the man on this list, Ben Godfrey, was an example of he wasn't going to play if he wasn't ready. So when Omobamidele came into the team, I was very much sort of leaning on that, and I think that sort of paid off, hasn't it, with his quality really shining through. I think we're sort of okay for transfers now. I would say it was a successful window in terms of incomings and outgoings, and I think I see Tom Tribal here as an outgoing. I think you can sort of band him with Tim Closer as part of this refresh that was needed, because it was pivotal, wasn't it, for Norwich?
Yeah, it was. Actually, if any of them surprised me, it probably was Tom Tribal. He was the name that I thought, well, hang on, he has done it in the Championship, and you felt still had a bit to offer. Again, we didn't know how good Ollie Skip was going to be at this point, so looking back, he probably wouldn't have played. But I thought Tom Tribal, a proven Championship title winner, going to a Blackburn team who, and again, just to prove that we certainly don't get everything right, I thought they looked like a bit of a decent bet, Blackburn, to be promotion challengers at the start of the season. So it was as much where he'd gone as to the fact that he'd gone at all that made me raise an eyebrow or two. But again, on that one, they're absolutely right. And no club's going to get 100% of its transfers right every single year. So you have to give them, even we're talking here with the benefit of hindsight, you've got to give them some leeway with all of them. But even now, it's difficult to find fault with what they did transfer-wise last summer.
Yeah, and that's a result of the trust they built with us, really, for the previous years and sort of the success from the transfer windows. Obviously, the last time we got promoted, that transfer window really wasn't very busy at all, was it? I think it was mostly sort of players going back to clubs like Harrison Reed, Angus Gunn, etc. Felix Paslak, I think, was another example. I think it was Pookie Buendia and Krul were the only signings I can really remember from the last time we went up. And you look at this list here and you've got pivotal players, Ben Gibson, I almost said Poeta then, Ollie Skip, Hugel I'm going to put down, Kieran Dowell, etc. So it's just really bizarre, isn't it, to sometimes watch these Norwich City transfers unfold. Yeah. Now, in terms of matches, you referenced the Luton away game. Wasn't a particularly pleasant day, but as you said, and I've got the lineup in front of me, if I just pull it up quickly, you've got players like Josh Martin, Dan Barden, Sam McCallum, Ballymumba, to an extent sort of bit part players, maybe Alex Tettey, Lucas Rupp, Jordan Hugel, who was said to be Timu Puki's number 2, and then on the bench you've got Mario Vrancic and Arnel Hernandez as the only names that were actually sort of recognisable at the time. You've got Omobamidele on there, who we now know, of course, but it was a really bizarre game, and it was kind of a painful time, really, wasn't it? One, for the fact that obviously the international break was not convenient at all. I remember Daniel Farker being quite frustrated about that, and that's absolutely fair enough. But also, it was a chance for Norwich to sort of really use these new signings to be like, look, we're not going to struggle this season. That wasn't the case. From a Norwich City fan perspective, was there ever any concern, or was it just a case of, look, it's the international break, we don't really care about the cup in this very congested schedule, let's just sort of look past it?
Yeah, I think it was such a strange day. I mean, for a start, the League Cup being before the first league game, that I don't remember that happening before. And the fact that, so many players were missing as well. As you were talking there, you talked about pulling the lineup up. So I thought I've got my commentary notes here, my book for the season. From
that's
that
a bit better than my lineup.
I thought, do you know what? I'll never remember who was playing in that game. I think even now you do really well to challenge people to name the starting 11 from that match. And I remember thinking, Daniel Barden in goal. A few of us really knew who he was until we knew who was going to play in that game. And I think we all wrote that down thinking, we'll put that name away because that's going to be a good pub quiz question in the future. Actually, he's gone on to play quite an important role this season, hasn't he, on the odd occasion? So we all know him now. But yeah, you look at that team. I think my abiding memory from that game was I felt really sorry for Mario Vrancic
Yeah,
because he was still on the bench,
yeah,
even with with the number of players that were missing. He was still on the bench. I wasn't too upset when Norwich lost the game. I think remember it was 0-0 with 12 minutes to go and ended up losing 3-1. So a bit of a flourish late in the game. I think it was one of those that you just had to put down to experience and the fact that so many players were missing. And I remember vividly interviewing Christoph Zimmermann after that game. And him saying, look, this is going to take time. And already I was sort of bracing myself for quite a tough season at this point because he was saying, look, we're not going to hit the ground running and we know what the Championship's like and we just lost 3-1 to Luton and we've got to be careful here. We can't just walk it. And I remember my heart slightly sinking and thinking, is it going to be one of those seasons? But he was right. He was absolutely right, Christoph Zimmermann. He's a canny bloke. He's been here long enough now to know the Championship. And that was one of those games where it didn't feel like it particularly mattered because it was only the League Cup and so many players were missing. But it was a little sign that we're not, until we get everything sorted, we're not going to have it all our own way this season.
Yeah. I think I echo that sentiment in terms of when he said that. It was a bit like, this could unfold in a very interesting manner, to say the least. But yeah, I didn't care, to be honest with you. I'd had the magic of the cup is, and I'll use Spurs away as an example. Going to that game, that's what the cup's about, isn't it? Sort of going there with the fans. It's all about the experience in the away end rather than the football. Obviously, Spurs away before the penalty shootout was brilliant. It's a lovely stadium, and it was a really good time. Obviously, Norwich went on to win that game. That was brilliant. There's an exception for the league and no fans, maybe, I suppose, because you look at this season as an example. Us not being there, we get to go and see Premier League football next season, whereas for the cup we weren't going to be there, so I wasn't bothered at all. Now, if we move on to Huddersfield away, Huddersfield, I think, had also undergone a bit of a transition. The managers have chopped and changed there a few times over the past few years, so I don't really remember or know now what my expectations were ahead of that game. All I wanted was a Norwich City win. Norwich won the game. Adam Eder, who, for him, I think it was probably a frustrating season, wasn't it? He obviously got suspended, injured. I think a lot of people, I remember Billy Dunstan on this channel making a really big deal, and I don't blame him at the time, of thinking this is going to be his breakthrough season. And obviously a goal on the opening day suggests maybe it is. But that game specifically, I remember, I was kind of excited to see sort of the Dow, Cantwell, and link up and how that was going to work, because, these two young English creative players, it didn't really work at all, did it? Norwich it was a bit of a slow performance, as has been the case throughout these first few games of the season that I've got here in front of me. What did you make of that game? Because obviously the stakes change completely, don't they, when it's a league game?
They do, and yes, it wasn't the most impressive performance, but I came away from that first league game of the season feeling really, really pleased and really, really optimistic. And the reason for that was that Norwich had won a proper championship game. You've got to remember, this is, we haven't won a game for ages at this point. We haven't won a game since, before COVID. We've had Project Restart and then we've lost to Luton and everything we've talked about. So just seeing Norwich win was good enough for me. And the way they did it, I was really, really pleased with, because it was a horrible game. It was pretty ugly championship fare. It wasn't the highest on quality, and yet Norwich ground out a win. And that's just the sort of thing that teams who are down from the Premier League struggle to do so often. When it comes down to, do they really want it? I don't want to use horrible cliches about doing it on a cold Tuesday night, because it wasn't. This was the summertime. But it's that sort of thing. It's the occasion that you're not relishing. It's Huddersfield away. Are you really going to turn up, Timo Pukki and co, and do it? And actually they did. Todd Cantwell, I remember him getting stuck in a couple of times and really unsettling, the experienced Richard Stearman, who then made the mistake from which Pukki set up Adam Eder to score. And I agree with what you said there. Eder didn't start that game, but I really had him down as breakthrough this season. I thought, right, actually relegation might work in his favour. There are going to be more games in the Championship. He's going to get more opportunities, and I expected him to get a fair few goals this season. And he bookended it, didn't he? He got the first goal and the last goal, but only one league start in between. So I think that just shows how difficult it is, really, as a footballer to really get going in the Championship. But I've still got high hopes for him. But yeah, as much as that wasn't the most spectacular result, and certainly not the most memorable result of the season, you just saw the makings there of a team that actually could do this in the Championship and was up for it. It's the first time we see Skip and McLean playing together in the centre of midfield from the start, which I think is interesting. A lot of that team changed. I mean, I can't believe now the centre backs were Godfrey and Zimmerman.
Yeah, I was going to
First game of
say,
the league
yeah,
season. It's amazing, isn't it?
it
I
is, yeah.
would not have told. I would not have guessed that, even though I was there. So yeah, it does. In some ways, it doesn't seem that long ago, but it feels like a lot has changed since.
Yeah, Norwich have grown immeasurably since, haven't they? And as you mentioned now, I was literally thinking, what am I going to say next? And I'm definitely going to mention Godfrey and Zimmerman. It's bizarre, isn't it? Because now at the end of the season, Gibson and Hanley, they're the two we love and adore. And I think that win was, I think the word I use is satisfying, wasn't it? Because as you said, it was a proper championship game, and throughout this the post-lockdown period, Norwich just nothing went for them, and it was nice to see something actually go for us. You mentioned the Stearman mistake; it was a horrendous back pass, and it was typical Timu Puki selfless play, wasn't it? And it was like, there's the old Norwich. That's what you love to see, capitalising on these mistakes, and it was something we didn't do enough in the Premier League. So it was nice to see that sort of progression. Now, for the games after, I don't think we can sort of speak too glamorously about, but we shall speak about them nonetheless. You got Preston at home.
This was welcome to the Championship, wasn't it?
It very much was the case. And we should also mention the fact that Daniel Farke's history in the Championship, typically, he doesn't have quick starts, does he? You look at his first season, well, that whole season never really got going, did it? The second season was a very slow start. I remember before winning the title, that loss away to Sheffield United, and people were thinking, maybe it's time for Farke to go. And I don't think that was really the case, to be honest with you, for this season. But, Norwich managed to win, and that's a positive, isn't it? Now, Preston at home was it like a pilot event to try and get fans involved? How much of an influence do you think sort of the fans being there had on the performance? Because it was another weird game. I think they're all weird games this season, but I remember the only thing I actually remember from that game specifically, other than the 2 goals, is that horrendous miss from Poeta. But was that just another weird game for you?
Yeah, I think your attention was sort of torn in different directions, wasn't it? Because you had fans back in, but it wasn't many fans, and it felt like there was. For me, I wasn't watching the players warming up when we were doing commentary and getting ready for that game. When I had the opportunity, I was on the stairs of the gantry looking out on the car park, looking at the queues of supporters coming into the South Stand to sit below us, because it was like, wow, this is a big moment. This is supporters back into football. This is hopefully the start of Carrow Road being full again. A false dawn in the end, sadly, because of the dreadful COVID rates we had after that. But yeah, having fans back in felt important. It felt big. I think the other thing we were all thinking about, I don't know if I've got the right Saturday here, but was this not the Saturday where the Max Aarons Barcelona link emerged?
It was, yeah, you found out the day before, yeah. I believe you said, yeah.
That's right. It was, the sort of morning of the game. It was, it had gone into one of the national papers, hadn't it, that Barcelona wanted Max Aarons. So that was the other thing that was sort of hanging over it as well. We were all sitting, we'd lost Godfrey, we'd lost Jamal Lewis, and now, was Max Aarons going to play? Was it Barcelona really? All of that talk was doing the round. So this is what Daniel Farke, he openly said it at the start of the season, and he was proved absolutely right. Sometimes it does pay to listen to football managers when he said, look, we've got to get this transfer window closed. We've got to wait for all this to settle down, because that first little month or so of the season was so disruptive with speculation and things like that. And it goes to show, I'm just looking at the team sheets from that game. It goes to show how much you can disregard these opening few games of the season, because you look at the Norwich team, and you've still got Zimmerman and Godfrey playing at the back, for example. You've got Ben Davies playing in central defence for Preston, who, if I told you actually he's going to finish the season at Liverpool on that day, you wouldn't have believed it, would you? And Ben Pearson in midfield for Preston as well, who we all saw come back with Bournemouth later on in the season. So yeah, so much changes after the opening weeks of the season. It was the first point on the board at home. It was disappointing Norwich didn't win it, but again, they were 2-1 down for a long time, and they got a goal back in. So that there was a little bit of grit, a little bit of substance to it. 4 points from 2 games, I was pretty happy with, given the way they'd done it. That the fact that they hadn't had things all their own way, and yet they dug in and got a couple of results. So again, there was enough for me to take from that game not to be too concerned.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on with your assessment now. I wasn't actually watching that game at the time. I remember I was in Averley for a Dereham Town game. I remember just seeing that we'd scored, and I thought we were 2-1 up for the Poeta goal, but that was not the case. But Poeta missing that wild open goal, for me, him then sort of bouncing back and scoring the equaliser sort of signifies Norwich's season, just resilience and going against the grain. Now, that grain, I don't think was really sort of beyond Norfolk in terms of this idea of bouncing back. As I said earlier, I do think sort of everyone outside of the borders thought we have to bounce back up. But there was this idea that Norwich all season have been very resilient to perhaps my own expectations in terms of I didn't genuinely expect us to do this well. Now, a very interesting game now, Chris, in Bournemouth away, and we talk about speculation, we talk about anything really disrupting the flow of a very weird. Now I keep using that word weird. I can't use another one, to be honest with you. Bournemouth is a weird milestone in terms of this idea of Emi Buendia and Todd Cantwell. That was sort of the climax of the fiasco in terms of this idea of Buendia and Cantwell perhaps kicking off at something I don't really know. Can you just tell me a bit about that? Because I'm only a fan, and obviously you're way more clued in. What was that sort of situation? How did that really play out?
Well, I didn't do this game. My colleague Phil commentated on this game. I wasn't there, so I was like a fan on that day. I was following it from afar, and I was still my relationship with football did suffer during the project restart and during lockdown, and for the first time I was not at a game and I didn't really miss it. I wasn't that fussed about missing it, and I didn't get the iFollow. I didn't tune into it. I just sort of followed the result, listened to a bit of the radio commentary, but I wasn't as up with it. I think that said where I was with football at the time. I was feeling a bit downbeat about it, and it felt like there were so many more important things in the world. And yes, the result was disappointing. Norwich lost to Bournemouth, one of the teams that they'd come down with. But it was what Daniel Farke said afterwards to Phil, my colleague, Phil Daly, that really caught the imagination. It felt like Daniel Farke was going to do that whatever. He had something to say, and he did go in on Todd Cantwell particularly, and Emi Buendia, I think, was mentioned by association as well. And alarm bells were ringing then for me, because I know we've said that Daniel Farke has been an expert in handling young players, and so it's proven since with what's happened after this Bournemouth game. But when you've just lost in the Championship, when you've lost a couple of your players as well. I think Godfrey was still there then, wasn't he? But he was about to go. Jamal Lewis had gone. There's all sorts of speculation about Max Aarons. Now suddenly you've got Todd Cantwell and Emi Buendia not being involved and their attitude being questioned. And you start to think, hang on a minute, are the wheels about to come off here? That this is starting to feel like one of those seasons where a team comes down from the Premier League, the players have had a sniff of the Premier League and think they should still be there, and suddenly don't fancy the Championship. Now, strangely, we hadn't seen that on the pitch in the first couple of league games of the season. It looked like, actually, they're going to be all right here. They're going to knuckle down. But Daniel Farke's comments I found particularly alarming. And I thought, we're at a crossroads here now. Quite often, once a manager starts saying things like that about players, that tends to be the beginning of the end. And they don't tend to come back from that. And certainly the relationship is never the same again. And it's only a matter of time before players leave. I think of all the things that have happened at Carrow Road this season and at Norwich City Football Club, I think the way that Daniel Farke handled that and the way that he got Emi Buendia and Todd Cantwell, not just in the team again, but playing as well as they did, I still don't think Daniel Farke has had anywhere near enough credit for the way he handled this situation, because I don't think I can have been the only one who was fearing that this is the start of a bit of a decline now. This is a worry. Mm-hmm. It's probably the most worried I was, even after Project Restart, when you start hearing things like this coming out of the club and it starts to feel like it's an unhappy camp. Actually, it wasn't that at all, we now know. But at the time, those alarm bells were ringing. And I seriously think what we've got out of Todd Cantwell and Emi Buendia subsequently, and how all this has been forgiven and forgotten, and rightly so, because they've proven themselves and they've proven themselves committed to the cause. But the job Daniel Farke did, the way he handled this situation, it's got to be up there with one of the best things he's done as head coach at Norwich City. It shows why he is such a good coach, I think.
Yeah, he's not afraid to sort of put his thoughts out there, is he? Which is it marks sort of the ethos of Norwich now, isn't it? Which is transparency, and it's something we haven't, from my perspective anyway, in my lifetime, it's not something we've always had. Which I remember when Stuart Webber first joined and he was doing his first sort of interview rounds, it was so refreshing, and that level of transparency has been maintained. And for me personally, you know, I've absolutely loved it. It's so nice to sort of get that insight into your club. And you mentioned sort of, are the wheels going to fall off here? There's a plethora of case studies, isn't there, of teams coming down from the Premier League and struggling. I'm thinking of Stoke a few seasons ago, Fulham a few years ago, maybe
Norwich a few
QPR,
years ago.
Norwich a few years ago. Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? And I think of Norwich specifically again in terms of players. You look at Moritz Leitner, Josip Dermic, again examples. Nelson Oliveira, that was Daniel Farke's within his first few months of his job. It's incredible, isn't it? And as you rightly mentioned, Daniel Farke, I don't think it's possible to give him enough credit for how he handled that situation. I remember in the Premier League, I should say, I was going to say last season, technically 2 seasons ago now, when Buendia was in a bit of a rough patch, wasn't he? I remember after the Watford game thinking Buendia needs a bit of a rest here because he was taking too much on. He got dropped, he came back, and he was a different beast, wasn't he? The stats ended up being that he was, the fifth most creative player in the Premier League at the time, which was ridiculous. So Daniel Farke's man management has been absolutely phenomenal, and long may it continue. To move on...
That's
Sorry,
a
go
key
on.
point. Yeah, before you do, actually, I think that's a key point you made there. We spend a lot of time as journalists, as reporters, as fans, talking about transfers and talking about how, well, we need this player here and we need this guy will be the last piece of the jigsaw. And yeah, that's important. You've got to get your transfers right. But what I think probably isn't talked about enough is how much it is possible for a player to improve and for a player to grow into the role that he's given, to understand it more and to benefit from having some faith shown in him from his head coach. And I think you look at someone like Todd Cantwell, and that's just a great example of that, because when Norwich were promoted a couple of seasons ago, the last time, he was involved. He played several games, but he wasn't, starting. He wasn't in the first 11, if you like. And he did have to fill in for Emi Buendia when he was suspended towards the end of the season. And Norwich didn't win a couple of games, and Cantwell started to get a bit of criticism. And then that summer, Norwich had gone up. Patrick Roberts, a promising young footballer from Manchester City, came into the club, and I think some of us wondered whether that might be, well, actually, Todd needs a bit of time back on loan in the Championship. But no, he really grasped it that summer and came back into the team in the Premier League and was fantastic. And I don't think has looked back since. I think he's a wonderful player, Todd, and I think that was the making of him that summer, where I felt coming out of the Premier League, it was probably only Todd Cantwell and Tim Krul who could have come out of the Premier League season, the last time Norwich were in it, thinking they'd truly done themselves proper justice and really had, left a mark on the season. They were the only two players that did that for me in terms of their potential and what I thought they would do. So, yeah, I think that's one of those things. That's not a transfer. That's the squad improving by a player listening to a head coach and a head coach improving a player, which can happen. And that's what's so fascinating now. There may well be players at Norwich City we've not seen much of this season, who we're not thinking of as regular starters in the Premier League, who will now kick on. And I think that's something that we mustn't underestimate. As much as I'm not saying they should do that instead of signing new players, of course, they've got to sign new players, they've got to strengthen the squad. But that's just something that's overlooked quite a lot in football, I think.
Yeah, I think, Chris, I envy whoever, I'm sure it'll be done at some point, whoever, for whatever reason, I couldn't name you a reason, does sort of a deep dive on Norwich City and they look at this period and experience all that we've spoken about for the first time, will just think it's absolutely fascinating watching it sort of unravel it. It's been incredible to follow. And Todd Cantwell, you mentioned there, I'm absolutely delighted for him, to be honest with you. He's obviously got sort of the boyhood club story, hasn't he, which is on its own isolated is really nice. But also, now I'll reference, I cannot remember for the life of me when it came out, but it was the podcast he did with the club, the All in Yellow podcast. And there's sometimes the caveat with club media where they control what comes out. Maybe it's not genuine, but that was such a candid interview, and it's such a credit to Todd Cantwell. He spoke so openly about how he grew up as a person, didn't he, over the summer, where it was his first experience of having his name touted with teams like Arsenal. You'd had Spurs fans, Man United fans on Twitter saying, "Come join us, Todd." And as a young man, and I'm a similar age to him in terms of this idea of that would be overwhelming. Like, obviously, I'm not going to experience that myself at any point. Maybe I can dream about it. But it must have been like turning his head properly. And he said it was. And the fact that he got his head down and, for me, has had a really successful campaign with Norwich. And I very much expect him to be here next season and also to be very successful next season. Is such a credit to him. It's a credit to sort of Daniel Farke, again, as you mentioned. I'm attempting to sort of make up for perhaps the credit I've not given to Daniel Farke in terms of this idea of just developing people, not only players but people, which is truly remarkable, isn't it? But the last game we'll speak about is a very interesting one. Again, very interesting and weird are words I use quite a lot. But Derby at home, Wayne Rooney won the game with his last goal of his career, which I only thought about this the other day. I thought of the irony that the reverse fixture was a Kieran Dow free kick quite late on in the game. I just found that quite funny. But Derby, who at the time had just sacked, no, they hadn't sacked Philip Cocker at that point, had they? And since then have struggled massively. They've just about stayed in the league. I know that as of today, an article came out saying that they're in some sort of trouble. I haven't really done too much research into it, but a 1-0 loss at home to Derby. Now, the first thing I'll say is I remember after that game, I was more positive than what I was after the Bournemouth one. Because for me, the Bournemouth game, Norwich weren't great. Whereas for Derby, for large chunks of the game, I remember the opening 20 especially, Xavi Quintilla sort of putting really good balls into the box. I thought, oh, is this the Norwich City we've been missing for quite some time? And then we go and lose to a team who, at the time and now, are struggling massively. What did that game sort of mean to Norwich's season?
Well, I don't think it's what it meant to Norwich's season. I think that's the game that kept Derby up, isn't it? Wayne Rooney's late free kick. Without that, they're down. Wayne Rooney scoring that goal at Carrow Road, it was the ultimate sort of smash and grab, wasn't it? And you could almost, the moment the free kick was given, you sort of thought, here we go. We know what's happening here. Norwich have dominated for 90 minutes. They've had chance after chance. This was where Pookie slipped, wasn't it, from the penalty as well?
It was, yeah.
Norwich actually had a penalty, and it's like, oh, come on, we've broken them down now. And he missed it in sort of really strange fashion because he lost his footing. And again, having had all of those emotions that we had after the Bournemouth game, where I was saying, oh, I'm not sure about this now. Is this going to be one of those years where it starts to go wrong? I think when you have a game like that at that point where your main man slips and misses a penalty and then you concede a real smash and grab, undeserved 87th minute free kick from
a lovely free
England's
kick.
Yeah, but from England's top goal scorer of all time, it's like, hang on a minute. This is just, what's going on here? This is a championship game. We're playing against a team that's really struggling, and yet it was a bit like someone's found a cheat code on a computer game, wasn't it? Suddenly you've got, oh yeah, Wayne Rooney's just going to take a free kick. It's like, what? And he scored. It was superb. But yeah, in the end, I remember again. You often think back to what people said at the time, and Ben Gibson played in that game, and we came across and did an interview with us afterwards, and talked in terms of, look, this is early in the season. We're doing a lot of things right here. And if we carry on like this, it won't be long before it clicks. And he was right. I mean, when you've just seen your team lose 1-0 2 weeks in a row, and you've got an international break to stew on it, then I think, because you care about the club, you do worry a bit. But, Gibson played in that game. The big thing from that game was Buendia coming back in as well. He was brought back in, wasn't he, by Daniel Farker in that game. Didn't have as much of an influence as we know he can do, and as he did do as the season went on. But it's all just starting to take shape now, isn't it? We've lost Kieran Dow, let's not forget, already, injured at this point. So that's another thing that just feels like it's stacking up against Daniel Farker. So, yeah, interesting. I think, looking back, it's if you knew what was coming after that, then you'd have accepted it gladly. That was going to be the last time Norwich would lose at home until they were already promoted. So, yeah, but at the time, it was just another thing that stacked up on your list of Norwich City worries. Hang on, we've just lost to a Derby team that's been poor here. And, is this the way the season's going to go? But no, it sort of drew a line under things, didn't it? I'm really glad you got me on to talk about the really best part of the season, by the way.
I was literally thinking that.
Yeah, well, I've got loads to say about 7-0 wins over Huddersfield, if you like, and last-minute winners, and the Rotherham game, the next one. In fact, that's the biggest win of the season. But no, you want me to talk about this awful start?
Oh dear! Well, someone had to do it. I thought, who better than the voice of Norwich City? The thing is, it's a weird one, isn't it? I spoke to the Alongcom Norwich boys after we did the review last year, and they were like, "Oh, thanks for letting us do sort of the post-lockdown mess." But someone's got to do it, and thankfully now we can look back on maybe not that part of the season, but the season with very fond memories. Now, before we wrap up, I do want to sort of extend our view, and now I promise I was planning on doing this before you said that. I want to extend our view beyond sort of these fixtures to the season in general. I want to ask you a few questions. First one being your biggest surprise of the season. Now, that can include result, transfer, any sort of story that broke. What was the thing that surprised you the most? And I reckon you can sort of split that into two in terms of a good surprise and a bad one. That's a very sort of on-the-spot question. I do apologise.
It is, yeah. I suppose... I think Barcelona coming in from Max Aarons was that just doesn't happen to Norwich, does it? Your players
it's a weird deal as well, isn't it?
It was. So that had to be one of the big sort of what? It's one of the big surprises. As good as I think he is, and there's nothing to stop him from getting to that level eventually. But not many players go straight from Norwich in the Championship to Barcelona, do they? So that was a bit of a surprise. But I think for me, it's the pleasant surprise really of the players that we've spent so long talking about here. Buendia, Aarons, Cantwell, Pukki, Krul, actually all being there at the end of the season, and the worries we've had along the way of several transfer windows now in a row, at least three or four transfer windows where we've thought, oh, they're probably going to go now, or we've got a real worry about holding on to them. The fact they're all still here and they're all on the pitch getting the trophy the other day at Barnsley, I think that in some ways has to be the biggest surprise, because they're such good players, and you look at what they could do for other teams, and other teams who you think, if they really wanted them, would have the wherewithal to come and get them, and yet they haven't. And I think for me, that has to be one of the biggest surprises. Maybe I'm biased because I watch these players every week, but I think someone like Emi Buendia, absolutely fantastic. And you look at Pukki, the way he can take a chance. Premier League teams haven't come in with offers that we can't turn down for them. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that has surprised me, and that we can be grateful for, because they're such good players. They've already played more games for Norwich City than I thought they would.
Yeah, it's just fascinating, isn't it? To be honest with you, and I think my favourite one. Now, I'm going to ask this question to sort of all of our guests throughout this little mini series, and my answer will change every time because I can't keep giving the same one. But my one at the moment is probably Lucas Rupp's redemption, because I remember in the Premier League before, it wasn't a pleasant time for him, was it? Now, I, for one, stuck my neck out on the line. I feel like a madman now still, when he was getting played ahead of Buendia in sort of that right wing position, where there was this sort of, I don't know whether he was injured or whatever, and I was making the case that, look, I understand why Lucas Rupp is playing. I don't think that's really a bad thing that Daniel Farke is doing. And this season, he hit the ground running. He played where he was comfortable. He formed a nice little relationship with Ollie Skipp, didn't he? And he proved that he's a very quality signing, and I think we got him for under £1 million, didn't we? And again, it's just an idea of this. Every single player this season for Norwich has played an important role, and that is what you would expect of a championship winning team. But it's actually happened, and it's happened in a very beautiful fashion. But yeah, I think that's my favourite one for now. Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure to go over this weird part of the season. I'll call it weird rather than unpleasant. I think it was slightly unpleasant, but we sit here months later with another championship title to the club's name. So we don't have to be too sort of bitter or sour, do we? Do you have anything that you'd like to plug? I saw a tweet from Rob Butler saying about a special episode of The Scrimmage to look out for.
Yes, well, we've got a couple of things coming up. Actually, we haven't quite finished the season yet. We've done a special interview with Alex Tetty, which is going out on Wednesday. We're calling it our Tetty Stimonial, which I think works. I'm not sure. It looks better written down than it is to say. The Tetty Stimonial. But anyway, we've got that. And then next Wednesday, actually, so that'll be the 19th, we're doing a special sort of Champions Evening, we're calling it. It's been such a relentless season, and we've had times where Norwich have been promoted one week, then confirmed champions, then they've lifted the trophy. We just wanted to bring everybody together, and we haven't had a situation yet where there's no open top bus tour this year. That's what's been missing, hasn't it? So we're going to try and bring as many of our panelists and our regular fans and people that join us together on the radio during Rob's show on Wednesday the 19th, and just have what we're calling Champions Evening, a chance to reflect on the season and celebrate it properly with other Norwich fans. And I've been tasked with coming up with a bit of a quiz of the season as well, so I haven't started work on that yet. So
you should put in the Luton team if you can name the full 11. That's a couple of points on the board, surely.
For the Luton game. That would be pretty good, wouldn't it? Yeah, extra points for the subs bench.
Yeah, that'd be remarkable. I mean, I've looked at it 30 minutes ago, and I can't remember a name beyond Vrancic and Hernandez on the bench, apart from Omar Bamadeli. So it's a very difficult question. For those watching / listening, we're now going to switch to Connor. Now, this was sort of due to poor scheduling from me, which I'll put my hands up and apologise for. But within this video, it's going to be a nice, seamless transition. Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure. For those watching, I'll see you in a second. So, Mr. Southwell, for those viewing and listening, this is a very seamless transition from my little chat with Chris Goreham. For us, this is the start of essentially a new podcast, but it's all going to be rolled into one nice little video. Now, where I left off with Chris was the home loss to Derby, and it was a weird discussion we had, because it was like, we lost to a team who are struggling significantly and have continued to struggle, but we left the game thinking, the football we played was actually pretty nice, and we were quite unlucky with the Timu Puki penalty miss, and Ben Gibson played that game, played very well. So there were plenty of sort of reasons to maybe be optimistic for the next game. Now, you made a point of this in your documentary, which is absolutely fantastic, by the way. The link to that will be left in the description down below, so make sure you go and watch that. You made a point of Rotherham away. Now, in terms of that match and its significance to Norwich City, talk to me about it.
Yeah, I think firstly, thank you for having me on. I feel a little bit like I don't know, not a letdown. It's a bit much, but sort of after the show, we're giving you've had Chris on before me, but anyway,
only down from there, mate. Only down from there.
Exactly. This game against Rotherham, I think going into it, is one of those games, isn't it? Cold, grey in the Championship, where you kind of think if a team has anything about them, then it's these type of games where they can grind out a win and they can show character. And I remember this one in particular, sort of coming after an international break, and Timu Puki was on the bench, and it just felt like there were a lot of possibilities about Norwich if there was this sort of relegation hangover. And obviously we'd had the events of Bournemouth a couple of weeks earlier. This was a really good opportunity to kind of turn the page and to almost start the season, really. That's how I viewed it, as almost a start to a campaign that they could then push on from, a foundation, I suppose. And that's certainly what they did. I mean, they went one goal down, and then you started to fear for them a little bit, I think, given maybe the physicality of Rotherham, the type of game it was. It was cold, it was grey, not particularly suited to a side who were looking to play possession-based football. Adamida was playing on the left. There was a lot of sort of round or square pegs in round holes, rather. And then you could probably argue the game turns on a penalty save from Tim Krul, and that's what he's so good at. Big moments, big players. It's that sort of thing. And it was a wonderful penalty save that almost seemed to kind of refresh the game and gave Norwich a fresh impetus to go on and win it, which eventually they did. And I think actually the equaliser, which was an own goal, wasn't it, from Michael Heckway, was probably one of the best team moves that we've probably seen all season, to be honest, in terms of the move that led up to that. And that, for me, really sparked, like you said, there were sort of shoots of progress against Derby, despite the result. This was kind of a major step for me in terms of progress and progression, because they looked like a side that had rediscovered how to win and that was capable of going to places that were relatively tough in the Championship, and not just attacking well and winning games, but equally having the character and the defensive resolve. And I think this was probably one of the first games that we saw Gibson and Hanley partner together. And that would be a crucial ingredient, I think, for their Championship success. So this is the game for me that I looked at and thought back to and thought, yeah, this is the moment where they really sort of used as a springboard to then gain some momentum.
Daniel Farke delivered in his post-match press conference, didn't he? The old footballing cliche. It's something to build on, and we have the beauty of hindsight and also a Championship title to Norwich's name to see that it really was. And me and Chris spoke a lot about, and I think most Norwich fans have spoken about this idea of everybody playing a role. You've got Tim Krul in goal, saving the penalty. Jordan Hugel, who wasn't prolific at all this season, stepped up, scored a 95th minute penalty. A fun bit of trivia: I was at a Durham Town game that day, and we also won that game because of a 95th minute penalty. So that was also that was just a bizarre day for me personally, but it's just so important, isn't it? Everybody playing a role this season, and as you mentioned, as Daniel Farke mentioned, as Ol now mentioned, an absolute turning point really for Norwich's season, to be honest with you. Not that it was all doom and gloom, but that gritty win was so important. Now, we come up to two games that were very, very I think satisfying is the word I'll use. You've got Birmingham at home and Wycombe at home as well, both saved by the man to be released now at the end of his contract, Mr. Mario Vrancic, a man we love, a man we adore, a man who donned the number 8 brilliantly. I remember after Johnny Howson left, and I'm sure you were the same, we were a bit worried as to how sort of those boots would be filled, but Mario Vrancic, he came in with his blonde hair, his blue boots, and he did the job sublimely, didn't he? And those two games were saved by him and his excellence, really. So we'll start with the Birmingham game, because there were two very different performances. Both teams struggling, both teams that we expected to beat, didn't we? Thankfully we did. I remember just before that period we were saying how important it would be for Norwich and how and how we expect wins. The Birmingham game, we dominated them, didn't we? And it was Aitor Karanka who, he's not still the Birmingham manager, is he? Who is it now? It's the former Charlton guy.
Lebo, yeah.
Lebo, yeah, that's it. But Aitor Karanka has made a name for himself in the Championship, has he? As a man who doesn't like to play sort of very delicious football, not very easy on the eye. But I think the state Birmingham were in, they needed some sort of solidarity. I don't know if that's the right word to use or not. But they came to Norwich, and I think Karanka apologised after the game, didn't he, for how he set up against Daniel Farke. And that was a really satisfying win, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, and particularly given what we spoke about against Rotherham, the fact I think you could have seen Norwich winning and then maybe stumbling or drawing in this game, and suddenly that momentum we spoke about sort of deflates a little bit, and everyone's kind of looking at each other, wondering when the season's really going to start to get rolling, and not just internally, externally as well. So it was a really important 3 points to follow up on that. But you're right, I think Birmingham are probably the least ambitious team I've seen at Carrow Road this season. I mean, They did. I think they had Scott Hogan up front. He was chasing balls over his head, and it just didn't make a lot of sense the way they approached it. It was and look, I don't blame teams for coming to Carrow Road and being pragmatic and looking to protect what they have and limit the space and shut the door almost on Norwich. But to do it to that extent, where you almost have no desire. They didn't look like they had any desire to go and attack. They didn't have any desire to go and be expressive, even on the counter attack. It was so dogmatic and so stubborn in their approach that it made the game really difficult, I think, for Norwich, because every time they turned over the ball, Birmingham, they weren't really going anywhere. So Norwich couldn't then have space to counter or sort of counter press or anything like that, and it was a strange game, and one that, like you said, because of the way they played it, was always going to, I think, be decided by a moment of quality, because they were stubborn, but they defended relatively well in kind of mass numbers. So Norwich needed to work incredibly hard, and they just needed to be patient because, and we've seen this a lot this season, they dominate the ball, and if you can dominate the ball for a prolonged period of time, eventually your opponent gets harder. And I always say this, and sometimes people are like, well, that doesn't make sense. But I know, having not played the game at a particularly high level, but certainly have played the game, it's more difficult to play when you don't have the ball. When there's this saying, isn't there, in football, let the ball do the work. And I think there's certainly some truth in that. And I think Birmingham, in the end, mentally, physically, were tired and fatigued, and then suddenly space opened up, and that's where eventually a ball bobbled in the right direction for Mario Vrancic to sweep home. And we were mentioning about Tim Krul and kind of big players and big moments. He is someone that throughout his time at Norwich has produced some unbelievably special moments. I think if you were going to compile a list of sort of Daniel Farke's era and note down all the really memorable goals and moments, the majority of those would involve Mario Vrancic in some way, and this was no different. But in terms of the game, very difficult, and probably a sign of things to come, although on an extreme kind of version of what was to come, because it feels like we saw maybe 11 or 12 games like that at Carrow Road this season. So it was good for Norwich to get that under their belts early on, and also good for them that they could prove that they can break down a fairly stubborn side, which they managed to do. But yeah, no surprise from there that Birmingham found themselves sort of at the wrong end of the table, I don't think.
Yeah, patience is a virtue that Norwich fans have had to live with, haven't they, over this past sort of 4 or 5 years, and to that game specifically. And I don't know where the quote is from. I know it's from you. It might be from the documentary where you said football is about moments, and the fact that, now this is beyond sort of this specific game, but the fact that Mario Vrancic is such an important part of so many special memories is remarkable. Now, I'm gutted to be speaking about this Wycombe game without fans, because that would have been another special moment, wouldn't it? A 95th minute free kick, an unbelievably good free kick. Like when you draw a goal and you point to where you want the ball to go, that's where you point. And it was ridiculous, wasn't it? It was side netting, postage stamp would have gone through the stanchion. It's ridiculous. And how sort of like, for you personally, but as well as maybe now, I want you to sort of maybe a bit of method acting here, get into sort of Mario Vrancic's head, and how, no fans, how does that affect that goal to you in terms of sort of significance and sort of, as you mentioned, special moments?
Good question. I think it's tough regardless, because Wycombe were very good that day, very, very good.
Yeah.
They probably left feeling aggrieved. They would have felt or left feeling aggrieved if they'd have only taken a point from the game. I think they were pretty decent. I don't want to say they were completely dominant because I don't think that's necessarily true, but they certainly warranted a point. But I think you could probably state their claim that possibly they deserved all three. And again, it was kind of similar. It was a bit more. It wasn't the Birmingham approach where they kind of sat back. They really took it to Norwich. They tried to run at them and press in packs, and it was immensely difficult. So I think for that moment, and you've got to remember as well, sometimes it's harder for a player. People mention, sometimes it's easier in behind closed doors, and I've seen it referenced that Manchester City, Norwich, sides that like to keep the ball, and maybe it's easier for them because it's almost like they can play that style of football whether there's 70,000 people there or whether there's no people there, because of how sort of the way it's kind of produced and structured and coached, and so to be sort of propelled into this moment where you're trying to win a football match, to move on to 3 wins on the bounce against a team that you're expected to beat in terms of expectation, and for that literally to be the game, for there to be a ball, a wall and a goal, and that is it, and the game is decided on that moment. To put your focus into that is one thing. To then produce the technique, the composure, the weight on the shot. I mean, it wasn't that far out. They're always difficult when you're trying to get them sort of up and over the wall from quite a short distance. It was a magnificent strike. He couldn't have struck it any better, and almost it's to his detriment, I think, that he produces these moments late on in games, because he kind of gets the tag as being like a super sub, right? Which is positive, but then equally, as he said fairly recently, it suggests you don't do it when you do start. So it's a difficult one, but those 6 points were incredibly important for what we spoke about earlier in terms of momentum, in terms of using it as a springboard to bounce into the championship season. And I don't think anyone should underestimate that. And that's what Mario Vrancic has been so good at throughout his Norwich career. It's producing those big moments. It's unlocking those doors when they seem to be absolutely shut and locked and bolted. And he manages to find a creak through, and he manages to find a bit of quality that wins points. And those players are incredibly rare. So in terms of what it was for him, I think it probably would have been, I don't want to say easier because it's still an incredibly difficult technique, but in terms of mentality, it would have been maybe for him a little bit easier to digest than maybe the Sheffield Wednesday one, where you've got a full house and everyone's kind of bouncing, and there's that moment of silence when you strike the free kick, and then obviously the eruption of noise. So I think this would have been an easier situation, particularly given it was earlier on in the season and we didn't ultimately know at that point where the season would end up. But you know, when you kind of look beyond the 97 points they got this year, there are individual contributions along the way that have mapped out. And we've just spoken about 3 there. Tim Krul's penalty save at Rotherham, Mario Vrancic's goal against Birmingham, and this free kick. That's already 3 points. Well, without those, not 3 points, that's already 9 points. Well, without those 9 points, they're second in the table, and Watford win the league. So they are big when you break them down like that. And he's a player that's produced sort of loads of them, and particularly at this level, it's a shame that fans weren't there. And Daniel Farker's kind of alluded to it all season at that moment, actually, as being the one that Carrow Road would have erupted at, and it would have, and it is a shame in many ways. But yeah, impressive skill, impressive technique. It's Mario Vrancic, isn't it? Classy.
It really is. For those watching, not so much for those listening, I just looked down a second ago just to Google something on my phone whilst Connor was talking. And before we leave this free kick alone, I think you'll enjoy this, Connor. Do you remember the game Score Hero on your phone, where it's like you flick where the ball goes? I don't think I would have been able, in 5 or 10 attempts, to do what Mario Vrancic did in that game, which again just describes how beautiful that goal really was. And what a man. As you said, it sums him up to an absolute T. And I'm gutted he won't be here next season, but there is sort of the wider point of it's time to improve. That's what you need to do to stay in the Premier League. We learned that last time, didn't we? Now, we are going to rattle through some sort of results, but the next 2 I still think hold great significance. The first, Brentford away. Brentford are a team, they've obviously, since that result, have done all right. I think many expected them to be in the top 2. There was that period during the season where Norwich dropped out of first, and everyone said, I think including myself at times, where, it's Brentford's league to lose now. That wasn't the case. But Brentford were a team with a point to prove in that they just lost the playoffs. I think they've had a bit of a history, haven't they, of not really sticking it out in the playoffs. Ivan Toney, who was on, and is still on technically, a very sort of fine scoring streak, How important? I feel like I keep asking how important, but that's the only question you can really ask about these results. But what was your sort of emotion then, and maybe what is it now in terms of the significance of that point away to a team who were expected to dominate the league?
Yeah, they dominated Norwich that night, that's for sure. I think Norwich were incredibly
With
fortunate to
Sorensen
walk
in left
away.
back, I'll just get that in there quickly.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And I thought Norwich were incredibly fortunate to leave that night with a point, actually. And yeah, it goes back to what I was saying in terms of momentum. It's important not to lose games at this level, and particularly when you get a few positive results in a row, like Norwich had 3 wins at that point, it can easily come undone if you lose one or if you fall on the wrong side of a result. So it's incredibly important, particularly going away from home, that you do not lose football matches. And again, I'll use the same word, character. When they went 1-0 down away at Brentford, who, as you said, promotion rival, good form, Ivan Toney, lots in their favour. And I think the resolve and the character that it shows to come back, and albeit score a deflection, it was a fortuitous goal and all of this, but to have that ability to bounce back and to come back and to keep knocking on the door and keep persevering, even though you're falling behind in the game, that is an incredibly important characteristic of any team, really, but any team gunning for promotion, I think in particular. It's often, you can have all the quality in the world, and we see plenty of teams in the Championship come down and have lots of quality, but often they don't have those intangibles that you need to get yourself back up, the leadership, the character, the characteristics that you need to form a winning mentality, to form a togetherness in order for you to then go on a run and stake your claim for the Championship promotion places. So for me, it's an incredibly important result in terms of that and in terms of momentum. In terms of leagues and stuff, I wasn't thinking that deep into, not to use a Daniel Farker expression, I wasn't going too deep with it. But I think, as you mentioned there, it was important in the grand scheme of things, because I view it like this: Norwich had just put sort of petrol in their car. You then wouldn't want the wheel to come off, if that makes sense. They just began motoring. They needed to continue doing that, and this for me was what it was. It was just another mile sort of down the road to where they needed to go, and one that wasn't entirely deserved, but one that they got, and that speaks volumes of their character.
Yeah, I was gonna say character is the buzzword there, isn't it? And this idea of, I mean, you can chuck it in the sort of the pile of games where Norwich perhaps didn't really deserve a result. That's happened a few times this season, but where we haven't seen it in the past, especially not in the Premier League, they just stuck it out, and that is exactly why Norwich City have won the league this season. Luckily or not luckily, but through hard work and perseverance. The dead opposite of luck, Norwich found their rhythm, didn't they? Sort of beyond January, and were incredible. But at this point in the season, the points were the most important thing, because the position Norwich were in, and me and Chris spoke about this in terms of this idea of it's not about performance, it's not about being patient, it's just about seeing some results to actually sort of, from my perspective, maybe from your sort of fan perspective as well, to see Norwich just sort of get some points on the board and perhaps show signs of bouncing back from a catastrophic relegation, catastrophic sort of in terms of on the pitch, not off the pitch by any means at all. But yeah, Brentford holds a lot of weight in terms of this idea of, especially because it's an opposition of such quality. And again, Jacob Sorensen in left back, let's just mention him. I love that man. Daniel Farker loves that man. Your little smile suggests to me you love that man. What a player. And it's just the fact that he'd not played a single minute professionally in that position to then just look like a natural left back. As a former left back myself, I really admire it. And just, I see, don't laugh, please don't laugh. But it's genuinely, it was so just fascinating to see, wasn't it? Before we now sort of rattle through a few results, again, a significant milestone in Norwich's season for me. Bristol City away, the most convincing performance, where I think we were perhaps a little bit lucky to not concede a second. I think Naki Wells chipped a penalty down the middle, didn't he? Like an absolute volley. If Nigel Pearson was the manager at that point, he would have been called much worse than an ostrich. But it was such an important game. That first half, Norwich blew Bristol City out of the water. I remember I was on the way to Derbyshire to watch Derham get absolutely pumped by Mikulova, and I was watching this Norwich team thinking, my God, where has this Norwich team been? You've got the Ben Gibson ball over to Buendia, fantastic touch, fantastic goal. You've got Steeperman finding Timu Puki, vintage Norwich City right there. In terms of that Bristol City performance, do you have that down as maybe your first performance where you thought, right, this is Norwich City in action?
Yeah, I had it down as the first time this season I watched Emi Buendia and said, yeah, he's a class above anything in this division. That was when it really felt like he was beginning to hit top gear. And just to go back on the point you made right at the beginning there in terms of the stage of the season and Norwich City needing to get points on the board, I'm quite a firm believer in that if you can get performances in place, that the results will quickly follow. But I was probably sort of closer to your mindset actually at the start of the season where particularly the first 5-6 games where it was just like, right, they just need points. It doesn't matter how they do it. They just need wins because obviously I sat in every home game after Project Restart and it was turgid. It was horrible. You felt it just had a rancid smell about it, if that makes sense. It was horrendous. And for that to completely leave in a 6-week period, which I don't even get stressed enough, it was a 6-week period between seasons essentially they had. It was so important that they got wins on the board early on, just to feel what winning was like again. And this Bristol City performance was the first time that I'd watched them and was convinced and felt like they were beginning to move in the right direction. I think you could probably stake an argument that in that opening period where, as we mentioned, they were getting points and they were getting wins, but they were having to do it by showing character and grinding out, and they were reliant on maybe individual moments. This was the first time they'd really blown a side away and they'd really impressed, and that was largely through the quality of Emi Buendia. And the opening 20 minutes, I remember Bristol City played a free at the back and Timu Puki ran them absolutely ragged. I mean, he got in behind, he just tormented them. Marco Stiepermann played and was very impressive on the day. But that Emi Buendia goal stands out. I think it'll stand out in my head for a long time. That lovely crossfield ball by Ben Gibson and the way he just cushioned it first time and killed it dead. That was different class. And yeah, it was the first time I looked at him and I think I even I'm casting my mind back, but I think I even turned to my colleague, which would have been Dave that day, and sort of said, "Wow, that's not a touch you see in the Championship." That was something that, you know, if you saw that touch in the Champion, if Messi did that touch, it's one of those, isn't it? That classic one. If Messi did that, it would be on social media and have 6 million views. You know, it was an unbelievable touch. So yeah, it was the first day I've been fully convinced by Norwich City, and it was the first day. When I say fully convinced, I'd seen shoots of progress, but this was the first time I think we'd seen kind of the first layer of the build, so to speak. And this was the first time I really looked at Emi Buendia and thought, yeah, if Norwich can keep him in the right headspace after everything that happened after Bournemouth, they've got not just the best player in the league, but someone who can win games and win points for them almost single-handedly when he's involved.
Yeah, towards the sort of beginning of this episode, I said to Chris, you know, the title of this video is expectation versus reality, and there was a stark difference sort of between the two, really, wasn't there, at the beginning of the season. For me, that performance is when they began to merge, and this idea of Buendia with that fantastic touch, it was expected, wasn't it? You expect nothing less from Buendia. Doesn't sort of taint how beautiful it is, but you expect it, and I think it was the manager Dean Holden at the time?
Yeah,
he looked traumatised after that game, didn't he? I mean, that might have been a result of the penalty chip, which, you know, again, Naki Wells, what a wally. When you threw one down, why are you chipping it down the middle? And Tim Krul was every Norwich fan when he went and just gave him an absolute mouthful of maybe not abuse, but some very stern words. Tim Krul, the penalty king, even when he's not saving them, he's just in your head, isn't he? That's Tim Krul's game. I'm going to sort of flick through some results now, and what I want you to do is perhaps pick out some that call to you in terms of maybe significance, positive, negative, whatever. So beyond Bristol City, there was a 0-0 draw at home to Millwall. There was a 1-0 win at home to Swansea. There was the 1-0 away to Middlesbrough. The 3-2 away to Stoke. We'll definitely be talking about that Stoke game. A 1-1 to Coventry with Marco Stiepermann up front. Yikes. And then the 3-1 defeat away to Luton. Before I sort of, maybe I pass on to you, I want to speak a little bit about, I think, the Swansea game at home, because for me it held the same significance in terms of importance as the Brentford game. I don't think many really expected sort of Steve Cooper's team to kick on and do as well as they have done. So a credit to him, he's done a decent job towards the back end of the season. A little bit of a bottle, but I think that happens naturally. He's doing a similar job to Daniel Farke in that the best players, they go, and there is an attempt at an attractive style of football. I think theirs is more sort of defensively built, isn't it? But in terms of that game, what does that mean to you in Norwich's season? Because obviously, I compared it to the Brentford game, and a win is better than a draw. And Marco Superman scored in that game. But maybe I'll put this to you as a more interesting question. Ballymumba, Josh Martin came on, and they changed that game. And just the youth. Talk to me about that game.
I remember being sat in the press box. I don't know what minute was on the clock, but I mean it was into the second half, and kind of turning my head and seeing Ballymumba and Josh Martin walk from, obviously where they're not dugouts anymore, but walking from their places in the stand to the side of the pitch in their yellow and green, and thinking, wow, this is brave. This is brave. If this doesn't come off, then I think he's in for a lot of criticism. And equally, I remember speaking about Daniel Farke in the summer and going, well, it's going to be really interesting to see if he stands by his policy on youth, and if he stands by his style of football, and the answers to both of those questions have obviously been a resounding yes. Obviously with tweaks in terms of the style of football, which I'm sure you'll get onto at a later point with someone else. But I just thought, given everything he'd been through in the Premier League, given how many questions have been thrown at him, including by me, by the way, I think it was incredibly brave for him to decide to turn to effectively two teenagers. And it showed actually that he'd come out of that horrendous end of the Premier League fairly unscathed in terms of his thinking and in terms of how he viewed football. He was still this sort of youth-enabling coach that didn't really see age as a barrier. He sees it as actually a strength, I think, at times. And when I think about Ballymumba, particularly his influence down the left, and obviously he arrived, for a bit of context, he was primarily a central midfielder at Sunderland. He had played, I think, at fullback for their under-23s. He was on loan at South Shields, who are certainly sort of deep in non-league. To then call upon him to ask him to effectively change a championship game, I think is incredibly brave as a coach. And I don't think... Yeah, exactly. In a fairly big game, Swansea were at the top of the table. Norwich were hoping to get to the top of the table. It was a big clash, and it was such a fiercely competitive game as well. A lot of experienced managers would have almost gone, I'm going to protect my young players, which is a nonsense. But that's what they'd have said. I'm going to protect my young players. I'm not going to throw them into that environment. And when they did came on, there was almost an intake of breath actually inside the stadium. I can't remember who exactly they replaced. I think Mumba came on for Sorensen, and I can't remember who Martin replaced. But yeah, it might have been. It was two fairly senior players. I know that, and it was kind of a this is very brave. And then what we saw for the however long left was Mumba absolutely tormenting. I think it was Connor Roberts on the right, and really getting at him and really dominating him in an attacking sense. And we kind of saw what I would describe as the Max Aarons qualities in him, the reason that people have looked at him and said, yeah, there's something there that we can mould into a long-term successor for Max Aarons. And he was unbelievable that day in terms of his impact and his pace and his poise and his technical proficiency. It was excellent. And that was a big call at a big point in the season. And again, we speak about big moments and big people and big players. This was a big coaching decision. And actually, I reckon if you lined up 100 managers, 95 of them wouldn't have made the substitution probably 99 of them wouldn't have made the substitution that Daniel Farke made at that time, and he did. And that is what probably stands him apart maybe from other managers in the Championship is that he had the foresight, but also the guts, the bravery to go, no, I'm going to stick two teenagers on here and they're going to win us the game. I think that's an incredible bit of management. And yeah, he deserves an immense amount of credit, I think, for that decision, because it was Ballymumba's influence that, I know it was Marco Stiepermann's strike and Emi Buendia's little touchback, but it was Ballymumba's surging run. And it wasn't just that as well. There was almost a relentlessness to the way he was running. It felt constant. He was Norwich City's source of productivity in that game. Certainly in that spell prior to which they scored. So it was almost pretty much down to him, to be honest, the reason they won that game. And Daniel Farke deserves a an immense amount of credit for playing a central midfielder who had been brought to be a right back in left back to win them a game of football. I think that probably sums up the bravery of the decision.
Yeah, it was Sorensen and Poeta who came off. So it was two players who were thought of highly. I think Poeta was maybe not as much, but as you said, it's this idea of a centre mid who was bought as a right back, going in left back, winning the game for Norwich. It's ridiculous, and it's what we come to expect from Norwich these days, isn't it? And that win was a satisfying one for me personally, as a big Marco Stiepermann fan, and it was a very significant 3 points. But then in a title-winning season, every sort of set of 3 points, every victory is always going to be labelled as significant. Now, I don't think we don't need to talk about Middlesbrough away. I think again that falls in the category.
Good, I wasn't there.
Yeah, there you go. That's worked out perfectly. But that game is just an example of many examples. There's a plethora of examples of games of 1-0s really. That was sort of Norwich's theme, wasn't it? It was 1-0 or 2-1 where we wouldn't blow the team out of the water in terms of goals, but we had that defensive stability, and Borough was an example of that. I think it was a Pookie penalty, wasn't it? And then there were some contentious decisions in terms of, I think Middlesbrough should have scored, Middlesbrough should have had a penalty as well.
No, they did have a penalty, didn't they? It was the double kick one where the referee said that he kicked it twice.
There you go, that's the one. Which again, that's the Championship for you. You get bags of that in the Championship, which is why we love the division so much. What I'll do is I'll stick my hands up and say I used to be pro Premier League. Since then, I've started thinking for myself and realised the Championship is a far better division to spectate. Right, so before sort of technology failed us, which is a massive betrayal because we're young people, so we've grown up with technology, so screw you technology. I was asking Connor about the Stoke away game where we saw some beautiful goals. We saw a replication. Is that a word? Have I made a word up there? Replication.
Probably.
Yeah. What was the other word I used to do that for? There was another word, wasn't it? It was dominative, wasn't it? There you go.
That's it. Yeah.
I'll have to make words up. All words are made up. But we were speaking about this idea that the Bristol City first half was the same as the Stoke 3-2 win in terms of Norwich just blew Stoke out of the water, and it was really attractive football, and it was satisfying. Again, I'm going to use that word constantly throughout this little mini-series where things are satisfying. But the red card for Emi Buendia, the injury for Tim Krul, which turned out to be quite a significant injury to him, and you said this in your documentary, didn't you, about this idea of, is this now... Now, I don't want to sort of be too extreme, but is it sort of a spiral for Tim Krul? Because before he joined Norwich, his career was halted. A very promising career was constantly stopped by injuries, wasn't it? How worried were you after the red card and also the injury?
Very concerned about the injury, I'll be honest, because it was one of those where he kicked the ball and then clearly felt something and there was no one near him, and I think that's kind of the stage where there was I mentioned it with the substitution against Swansea. There was an intake of breath, I think, from pretty much everyone in the ground, actually. And particularly given his influence, like there weren't many positive aspects of Norwich City's Premier League campaign the year before. Tim Krul was a massive one. He was player of the season. He made some unbelievable saves. Obviously that night at Tottenham, where I think he's pretty much ingrained his name into the Norwich City history books and ledger, carved his name into the legends wall or whatever, because it was an incredible night. As someone who was fortunate enough to be there, I know you were as well. It was unbelievable, and that was down to his penalty antics, and that moment. Yeah, I a lot went through my head, to be honest. It was kind of, as I mentioned in the documentary, this thought of he'd suffered a major injury playing for Holland in 2015. Hadn't really, prior to joining Norwich, played a lot of football since then. Had been second choice, had kind of gone round a little bit, and there is that fear actually that it could almost derail him again. And that's not questioning his ability. It's just he'd reached such a good level. It was going to be, is he going to be able to keep that up? Is he going to be able to raise that even further? And to his credit, subsequently, I think he's proven himself to be the best goalkeeper in the division. And actually, I know a lot has been made of the defensive record. I don't want to get too statistical because I'll bore people, but I don't feel like without Tim Krul, Norwich City don't have a good defensive record. That's kind of my view. And again, I won't go into the numbers of it because people fall asleep, probably including myself. But I think the numbers back that up as well. He's been very good this year. And equally, not been as busy. So that's almost more impressive, because concentration is really difficult when you're watching such a good team at one end, and you have to stand there and essentially wait for two shots to be at you all night, and you have to save them both. That's incredibly difficult, I think. So there was a concern, and then there was also that moved on from Tim Krul's situation to how it would impact Norwich in the short term. But yeah, as I mentioned, his distribution is so important for Norwich's game that when you bring in someone who can't do that as well, Norwich have to change. And we saw that with McGovern a little bit, not just in terms of on the night, but equally in the run that followed. Whereas Grant Hanley and Ben Gibson would go back to the goalkeeper, they were turning back, and Michael McGovern was his preferred kicking foot was different to Tim Krul. So even minute details like that, and so there was obviously a shift. Then you throw in the fact that the man in the opposition dugout is a man who is essentially responsible for elevating Michael McGovern into this championship, this goalkeeper that championship sides looked at after obviously the Euros. So he would have been all too aware of his strengths and his weaknesses and what to target. And, there's no surprise that he basically threw on the land of the giants at the end of the game. And it was set pieces all round. And yeah, I mentioned it again. I remember speaking to Ben Gibson after that game, and he said, and again, I'll use the word character. The fact you can go to, there's that phrase, isn't there? If you go to Stoke on a cold, Tuesday night, and you win there, you're probably half decent. And that was certainly, I think, felt by the players as well. So it was a massive win. And as you said, really Jekyll and Hyde in terms of the first half was all about them and their positive football and how they were sensational that night. I was fortunate enough to be at Bristol City and at Stoke, and thought I'd hit gold when they were 3-0 up, to be honest. And then equally, there was almost the game within a game when that sort of 20-minute spell came where they had to defend pretty much everything airily, and that was tremendous as well. And again, probably the two sides, the two facets of Norwich City on display that night, and yeah, a really seismic win, I think, actually in terms of the season, because if they'd have lost that game, does Michael McGovern have confidence? Does the defence have confidence in Michael McGovern? Does the team structure break down a little bit? I don't know. But yeah, it was trying to think of different words, significant or important, but that's what it was. It was massive, and it felt big as well. It felt important, and it just felt like this was a Norwich side that when they hit their top gear, certainly in terms of in possession, were very good. But also compared to 2 years ago when they were out of possession structurally, I know they conceded 2 goals, but they were able to see out games. They were capable of closing the doors and saying, right, that's your lot now. And yeah, Gibson and Hanley need to take a lot of credit out of that. And there's even sort of fine details in that as well, where Norwich will get the ball up the pitch, and all the voices you can hear, it's either a really sort of bold, deep Teesside accent or a big Scottish accent, and just pushing the back line 5 yards up the pitch. And that's often the difference between a team that concedes goals and a team that doesn't. They were aggressive in their defending. They looked like a side that wanted to defend, and I think that was showcased that night. And yeah, that's the reason that they managed to come away with that for a win. Although I'm not sure I had too many fingernails. That would have been impressive, getting my foot in my mouth in there, but I don't think I had too many fingernails left at the end of that game.
Oh, blimey, toenails. Oh, that would have been extreme. To be fair, I mean, throughout most of the season, there's been times where there's been no fingernails left, so you've had to look at the toes and go, should I? To which you then should say no.
It's a long way down for me. It's a long way down.
I was going to say, you've got all 7 foot to cover, haven't you? But I think the thing I want to speak about, now this will probably be the last thing we speak about, because I think the next 2 results are not interesting to anybody, but it was the social media reaction from the players to Michael McGovern playing, and it was this togetherness, this bond that they'd formed. Now, Michael McGovern, for as much as I genuinely think he should win the Save of the Season award, he's no Tim Krul. He's Michael McGovern, right? Need I say more? And I mean that with no disrespect. Well, I've sort of dug myself into a hole there, but you understand what I mean. But it was just the players' reaction and this togetherness, and it's this togetherness we expect from these players, but given sort of last season, given the fact that this season so far had been very tough, it was nice to see that they all just get on, and it's just a team effort. Football's a team game, and for as much as you mentioned, you absolutely hit the nail on the head there when you were talking about Tim Krul in terms of this idea of without Tim Krul, Norwich's defensive record isn't as good. that's why football's a team game, and it's just a beautiful thing, really. The results after Coventry at home 1-1. Marco Stephen was up front. I'm so fine with moving on from that. Luton away 3-1. That was following a 10-game unbeaten run where obviously sometimes it just happens, doesn't it, in terms of this idea of everything sort of catches up to you eventually. And it was a Luton team who had nailed the high press. I think they're a slightly lesser version of Barnsley this season, to be honest with you. So if next season they were to go on and have their success, the success Barnsley have had, I wouldn't be surprised. So I think that sort of result is totally fine. But yeah, I think that's everything for this episode of the review. We've covered quite a lot. This is a very hefty episode. And before we say goodbye, Mr. Southwell, what do you like to plug? Because you've been a very busy man lately.
Yeah, you know what? I don't even know what I've been up to. It's kind of reached that stage, to be honest. There's so much there. I guess probably the documentary, which hopefully a lot of people have seen already, and something that because you were involved in it, and you were obviously involved mainly in terms of the poem, which was a sensational bit of work, really, just all round. I can't really take the credit for any of it because all I did was stood in front of a camera and waffled, and then maybe I don't want to even say I oversaw the process really, because there's people like yourself who are far more talented than me in terms of video production that made that what it was. But I'm genuinely very proud of how that came out. So yeah, hopefully it's kind of a good way that we've been able to kind of immortalise and isolate a season that's been like any other. Both on the pitch in terms of the points haul, but then equally because of the situation around it, and hopefully we captured the emotion and all the high points and low points as well during the season. So yeah, Pinken YouTube channel, Pinken website, people can check that out, and yeah, hopefully they enjoy it as well.
Yeah, the documentary is well worth a watch, and the poem video too is probably the piece of work that I'm most proud of, making that with Jordan Blythe, who is sort of the main editor, producer of these videos as well. Just really satisfying. And for as much as, I said this to Chris at the very beginning, as much as it is gutting, I was gutted that fans couldn't be there. I was gutted I couldn't be there. I'm a half glass full guy, and this football has been something to look forward to during a very dark year, a very painful, very slow year, and the fact that Tony and the club, etc., have captured it so well in a video that we can look back on and will be there for the rest of time, really, unless YouTube was to ever close down, which hopefully it won't. But it's just a nice memory, and as we spoke about earlier, football is about memories, and absolutely this season is something we'll always remember fondly. We'll always be like, yeah, we weren't there, but at the same time, we won the league title, for Christ's sake, during a pandemic. It was something to look forward to. But yeah, in conclusion, we love Norwich City. That will never change, will it? Even if we go down next season, that will never change. But yes, Mr. Southwell, it's been an absolute pleasure. To those of you who have consumed this podcast in one sitting, you deserve a medal. If you have done that, you're crazy. I do just want to thank as well the people who listen on Spotify and iTunes. I do see your engagement. It is very much appreciated. I was surprised at how many people actually do listen via sort of the podcast networks, and I imagine this one will be consumed more in a podcast format than video. But yeah, Mr. Southwell, it's been an absolute pleasure. In part 2, we've got Mr. Hodgie the Hack and the Athletics, Mr. Michael Bailey, which is going to be very interesting. We're going to talk about the goalkeeping situation a little bit more, because we can't not. Big Bad Barden must be spoken about. But yeah, until then, we'll see you again very, very soon.